She snatched the boarding pass right out of a 9-year-old boy's hand. Not gently, not politely. She grabbed it and held it up like evidence at a crime scene right there in the middle of Gate 14 in front of everyone. Raina Bell, senior flight attendant, planted herself squarely in front of a small black child carrying nothing but a backpack and a manila envelope, and she said loud enough for the whole terminal to hear, "I don't think so, sweetheart. You are not getting on this plane." The boy didn't cry. He didn't run. He just looked up at her with those calm, steady eyes, and that somehow made everything worse. Before we go any further, if this story moves, you please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that terminal because nothing about what happened next was simple. The morning of October 14th began the way most Tuesday mornings begin, at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, with noise motion and the kind of organized chaos that only a major American hub can produce. Thousands of people moved through those corridors every hour. Business travelers dragging roller bags, families corralling toddlers, elderly couples moving slowly, carefully, holding hands near the moving walkways, coffee cups in every hand, eyes on every phone. Nobody paid much attention to the small boy sitting alone in the blue plastic seats near Gate 14. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with close-cropped hair, a dark blue hoodie zipped all the way to his chin, and a backpack resting between his feet, like he was guarding it. On his lap, he held a thick manila envelope sealed with a white label across the front. He held it the way you'd hold something precious. Both hands, fingers pressed flat against it. Not fidgeting, not looking around nervously. Just sitting there watching the gate with a patience that seemed strange for a child. His name was Malachi Wren, and he had been sitting in that exact spot for 47 minutes. He had arrived early, not because he was anxious, but because the instructions said to. The instructions said a lot of things. He had read them more than once. He knew which gate. He knew which seat number. He knew the name of his aunt, who would be waiting for him at the other end. He knew what to say if anyone asked questions. He had practiced. What Malachi did not know, what no 9-year-old could possibly have prepared for, was what was about to happen when the boarding process began. The gate agent, a tired-looking man named Gerald, had just made the first boarding announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning pre-boarding for Flight 1147 to Portland, Oregon. We invite our first-class passengers and any passengers requiring additional assistance to begin making their way to the podium." Malachi stood up. He picked up his backpack, adjusted the straps, tucked the manila envelope carefully under his arm, and walked to the line. Not the general boarding line, the first-class lane. The shorter one marked with a small sign and a strip of blue carpet that separated it from the rest. He stood in that line quietly, third from the front. That's when Raina Bell saw him. She was standing near the jet bridge door, clipboard in hand, reviewing something. She was a tall woman, professional, sharp-featured, with the kind of posture that told you she'd been doing this job for a long time and took it seriously. 22 years with the airline. She had seen everything, or so she believed. And what she was seeing right now did not add up. A child, alone, in the first-class line. She watched him for a moment. Then she walked over. "Excuse me," she said. "Sweetie, are you with someone?" Malachi looked up. "No, ma'am." "Where are your parents?" "I don't have parents here," he said. "I'm an unaccompanied minor." Raina glanced around the gate area. "Where's the adult who checked you in?" "The gate agent helped me when I arrived," Malachi said. "I have my documents." He reached into the manila envelope, or started to. Raina put out her hand. "Let me see your boarding pass first." He handed it over without argument. She looked at it. Then she looked at it again. Her brow creased. "This is a first-class seat," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Seat 2A." "Yes, ma'am." The two passengers ahead of Malachi in line had already moved forward to scan their passes. They were watching now an older white man in a suit and a woman in her 50s with silver earrings and a carry-on roller bag. Both of them had stopped moving and were watching the exchange with the quiet, careful attention of people who sense that something is happening but aren't sure what. Raina looked back at Malachi. "How old are you?" 9. She let out a short breath through her nose. Honey, is there an adult traveling with you? A parent, a guardian, anyone? No, ma'am, I'm traveling alone. I'm an unaccompanied minor. I have my travel packet. He gestured to the envelope under his arm. Who bought this ticket? A pause. My guardian. And where is your guardian? Malachi's jaw tightened barely just a flicker. She couldn't come. Rena stared at him. Then she stepped slightly to the side, lowering her voice, but not nearly enough. I need to be honest with you. A 9-year-old sitting in seat 2A traveling alone with no adult present, that doesn't make sense to me. Something about this doesn't feel right. I have the documents, Malachi said again. His voice was steady, quiet. It didn't shake. I understand you have some papers, sweetheart, but they're in the envelope. I'm sure they are. Her tone softened with condescension rather than kindness. But my job is to make sure every passenger on this aircraft is where they're supposed to be. And right now, I need to verify this. She had not given him back the boarding pass. He noticed. He didn't say anything. He just stood there holding the envelope and waited. The line behind him had grown. 6 people now. 8. They were watching. The gate area, which had been moving in that efficient autopilot rhythm of a busy airport morning, had quietly, imperceptibly begun to slow down. People were stopping, pretending to check their phones while actually watching, pretending to adjust their luggage while actually listening. Rena turned to the gate agent. Gerald, can you pull up the reservation on this boarding pass? I need to verify the unaccompanied minor program documentation. Gerald, who had been doing this job for 11 years and had processed hundreds of unaccompanied minors, looked up. He recognized the situation immediately. He walked over, took a look at the boarding pass Rena was holding, and said carefully, Ma'am, this pass looks valid. If he's checked in as an unaccompanied minor, the paperwork would have been processed at... I want to see it myself, Rena said. Pull it up. Gerald looked at her. Then he looked at the boy. Then he sat down at his terminal and began typing. Malachi stood still. He was not fidgeting. He was not looking around. He was doing that thing, that quiet, deliberate stillness, that a child who has learned not to make situations worse does. He stood with his hands at his sides, envelope under one arm, backpack on his back, and he breathed slowly and waited. A woman in the general boarding line spoke up. She was maybe 40, with a loud carry-on bag and the kind of voice that carries. Is everything okay over there? Why is he being held up? Nobody answered her. Rena said, I'm just verifying his documentation. This will only take a moment. But it was not only taking a moment. Gerald was typing, clicking, scrolling. His face was neutral, but his eyes were moving quickly. I have his reservation, he said. First class seat 2A. Name Malachi Wren, age 9. Unaccompanied minor notation is... He scrolled. It's flagged. Flagged how? Rena asked. Not flagged as a problem, Gerald said carefully. Flagged as there's a notation. Special handling. Let me find the detail. Rena turned back to Malachi. Can I see what's in that envelope? My travel coordinator said only to open it in front of an officer or a supervisor, Malachi said. That sentence landed differently than either of them expected. The woman with the silver earrings made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like a sharp intake of breath. The man in the suit frowned. Rena said, I'm a senior flight attendant. I am a representative of this airline. My instructions said a supervisor or an officer, Malachi repeated. Politely, firmly, like he'd been taught to say exactly that. Rena straightened. Her expression shifted not to anger exactly, but to something that looked like a decision being made. All right, she said. Then we're going to get a supervisor. She pulled out her radio. And that's when the situation changed, because up until that moment, this had been a quiet, contained thing. A gate area conversation. A routine or not so routine verification. But the moment Rena raised that radio to her lips and said, This is Bell at Gate 14. I need a gate supervisor, and if possible airport security. I have a situation with an unaccompanied minor. The words went out over that channel and into the ears of everyone standing within 20 feet. And the terminal, which had been pretending not to pay attention, stopped pretending. People turned. People moved closer. The general boarding line broke apart slightly as passengers craned to see. Someone was already holding up a phone. Malachi Wren stood in the middle of all of it and did not move. A woman pushed through the small crowd that was forming. She was younger than most of the other passengers' early 30s, with a colorful tote bag over one shoulder and the quick, decisive energy of someone who does not hesitate when something is wrong. Her name was Tessa Rowe, and she had been standing in the general boarding line for 12 minutes, and she had watched this entire thing unfold, and she had had enough. "Excuse me," Tessa said, stepping forward. "What is happening here? Why is this child being questioned?" Raina turned to her. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is an airline matter." "I can see it's an airline matter. I can also see that you have been questioning a 9-year-old child for the last 10 minutes in front of an entire terminal. What is the actual problem?" "The problem," Raina said, her voice taking on that clipped professional tone that people use when they're trying to project authority. They're not certain they have. "Is that I am trying to verify this child's documentation before I allow him to board a flight alone. That is my job." "He said he has documents." "He said he'll only open them for a supervisor or an officer." "Then get a supervisor." Tessa's voice rose just enough to carry. "Get a supervisor and let him open the envelope and verify whatever needs to be verified, and let this child board his flight." There was a murmur from the crowd. Not loud, but present. The kind of sound a crowd makes when someone has said the thing everyone was thinking. Raina's jaw tightened. "I have already called for a supervisor. Then we can all wait together," Tessa said. She stepped to the side and stood about 3 feet from Malachi, not touching him, not hovering. Just there. Present. A body that said this child is not alone. Malachi looked at her. She caught his eye and gave him the smallest nod. He didn't smile, but something in his posture shifted barely enough to notice, but it was there. One small degree of ease in a body that had been holding itself very, very carefully. The supervisor, Coulter Shaw, arrived 4 minutes later. He was a solid man in his mid-40s with a calm that came from having managed airport situations for nearly 2 decades. He read the room as he walked up: the child, the flight attendant, the small crowd, the woman standing near the boy with her arms crossed, the gate agent at his terminal looking increasingly uncomfortable. "What do we have?" Coulter said. Raina stepped forward immediately. "We have an unaccompanied minor presenting a first-class boarding pass for Flight 1147 who has refused to open his documentation envelope except in front of a supervisor or law enforcement." Coulter looked at Malachi. "Son," he said, his voice easy. "Is that right?" "Yes, sir," Malachi said. "You've got some papers in that envelope and you're waiting to open them. My travel coordinator told me to only open them in front of an officer or a supervisor, for safety." Coulter blinked. Just once. "For safety," he repeated. "Yes, sir." "Okay," Coulter said. He looked at Raina. "What's the issue with the reservation?" "First-class seat. 9-year-old. No adult present." She paused. "Gerald flagged special handling on the reservation, but couldn't pull the full notation." Coulter turned to Gerald. "What did you see?" Gerald cleared his throat. "Special handling flag with restricted access notation. That means the full detail isn't visible to standard terminal staff. It requires supervisor-level access or law enforcement credentials to view." That landed. The woman with the silver earrings said quietly, "Oh my." The man in the suit had stopped pretending to look at anything else. Tessa unfolded her arms. Coulter was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Get me Reed." Gerald was already picking up the phone. Officer Amos Reed was Atlanta Airport Security, had been for 16 years. He had the kind of presence that comes from years of walking through situations where things could go very wrong very fast, and learning how to be the steadiest thing in the room. He arrived at Gate 14 2 minutes after the call, took one look at the child standing in the middle of a semicircle of adults, and slowed his pace. He crouched down slightly as he approached, not kneeling, but lowering himself enough to be closer to the boy's eye level. "Hey," he said. "I'm Officer Reed. What's your name?" "Malachi." "Malachi." Reed said it like it mattered, which it did. I understand you have some documents you've been holding on to. Yes, sir. And you were told to only show them to an officer or a supervisor. Yes, sir. Yes. Well, Reed said gently, I'm an officer and this gentleman here is a supervisor. I think we qualify. He paused. Would it be all right with you if we looked at those documents now? Something passed over Malachi's face. Not fear exactly. More like relief and grief. At the same time, the face of someone who has been waiting for the moment when they could finally stop holding everything alone. He held out the envelope. Reed took it carefully. He stood and he opened it slowly. Not tearing, peeling the sealed edge back the way you'd open something you knew deserved care. He reached in and removed the first sheet. He read it. His face did not change. But something happened behind his eyes. Something that looked like a man receiving news he hadn't expected and was taking a moment to absorb. He read the second sheet, then the third. Coulter had moved to his side and was reading along. His face went very still. Rena, standing 6 feet away, tried to read their expressions and found nothing she could interpret. What is it? She asked. Reed did not answer her immediately. He finished reading, gathered the papers, and slid them carefully back into the envelope. He held it for a moment with both hands. Then he looked at Malachi. Son, he said quietly, you did exactly what you were supposed to do. Malachi didn't respond right away. He looked up at Reed, and for the first time since he had sat down in that blue plastic chair nearly an hour ago, his composure wavered. Not into tears, not into breakdown, just a flicker. Something in his eyes that said, I know. Reed straightened and looked at Rena. When he spoke, his voice was low and very controlled. Flight Attendant Bell, I need you to step aside with me, please. Rena started to say something. Now please, Reed said, and the way he said it left no room. She followed him 3 steps to the side. Coulter came with them. Gerald pretended to look at his screen. The crowd, which had grown to maybe 30 people, did not move. Tessa remained exactly where she was near Malachi, and she did not look away from the boy's face. Malachi stood there, and he waited again. And in that waiting, in those 40 seconds, while the adults spoke in low, urgent voices just out of earshot, he was 9 years old and exhausted and had been carrying something enormous for a very long time, and he was doing what he had been taught to do. He was holding on. Tessa took a small step toward him. Hey, she said softly, you're doing really well. He looked at her. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. Whatever's in that envelope, she said, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to explain it to anyone here. Okay, you don't owe anyone an explanation. Malachi's throat moved. He swallowed once. I know, he said. Are you scared? A pause so brief, it was almost nothing. No. Tessa studied his face. Okay, she said. She didn't push it. She just stayed where she was. Across the terminal, Reed was still talking to Rena, and whatever he was saying was taking the color out of her face, not all at once, but gradually, like light leaving a room as the sun moves. She listened. She started to speak once, and Reed held up a hand and she stopped. She listened more. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. Her eyes moved almost involuntarily back to Malachi. She looked at a 9-year-old boy standing with a backpack and an envelope, and she began to understand what she had done. Not fully. Not yet. But the first edge of it was reaching her, and it was worse than anything she had expected to feel standing at a boarding gate on a Tuesday morning. Coulter came back to the podium. He spoke briefly to Gerald, then turned to the gate area and raised his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay. We're going to begin boarding momentarily. If you could please return to the boarding line, we'll get you on your way as quickly as possible. The crowd moved slowly, reluctantly, the way crowds move when they're not ready to stop watching something. People shuffled back into line. Some of them glanced at Malachi as they passed. A few of the looks were unreadable. A few were not. An older black woman, maybe 65, paused near Malachi as she moved toward the line. She didn't say anything. She just reached out and rested her hand briefly on top of his head 1 second, too, and then she moved on. Malachi reached up and touched the place where her hand had been. Officer Reed came back to him. He handed the envelope to Malachi and crouched down again, back to that slight lowering, that effort to meet the boy where he was. "Malachi," he said, "I'm going to stay here until you board. And when you land in Portland, there will be people waiting for you. Your aunt has been notified. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "You're going to be all right." Malachi looked at him. "I know," he said again. And this time the steadiness in his voice was not performance. It was not the forced calm of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. It was something that had been built in him piece by piece in very difficult circumstances, and it was real. Reed stood up. He nodded at Coulter. Coulter picked up the boarding pass that was still sitting on the podium. Raina had set it down and never given it back, and walked it directly to Malachi. "Sir," Coulter said, handing it over. "Have a good flight." Malachi took it. He walked to the jet bridge door. He walked through it. And for a moment, just a moment, the gate area was very quiet. Rena Bell was standing by the wall. She was not crying. She was not apologizing. She was not doing anything except standing there with both hands at her sides, looking at the empty space where the boy had been. She had called security on a 9-year-old child because a first-class ticket didn't make sense to her. She had questioned him publicly in front of a crowd for nearly 20 minutes. She had dismissed his documents without reading them. She had made him stand in front of strangers and justify himself, and she had been wrong. Not about doing her job. Not about taking child safety seriously. About everything else. Tessa Rowe stood in the boarding line and watched the flight attendant's face for a long moment. Then she looked down at her own hands. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of adrenaline that stays in the body after you've done something difficult and necessary. She took a breath. She thought about what she'd seen today. What she'd watched that boy do. The way he'd held himself. The way he'd answered questions. The way he'd known exactly what to say and when to say it and when not to say anything at all. 9 years old. She thought someone taught him that. Someone sat with that child and taught him how to survive situations exactly like this one. And that thought, that single quiet, devastating thought, was the beginning of something. She didn't know it yet. But it was there already growing the way things grow when they take root in the right kind of grief. Gerald called the general boarding group. People filed forward. The gate returned to its ordinary business. And in seat 2, somewhere above the Georgia clouds, a boy named Malachi Wren pressed his face briefly against the window and watched the ground fall away. The airport, the city. The morning that had almost broken him and hadn't. And he held his envelope in both hands and breathed. He was on his way. But what was in that envelope? What Officer Reed had read? What had drained the color from Raina Bell's face? What had made a 22-year veteran of the airline go quiet in the middle of a boarding gate? That story was not over. It was in every way that mattered just beginning. The jet bridge door closed behind Malachi Wren, and for exactly 4 seconds, nobody at Gate 14 moved. Then everyone moved at once. The woman with the silver earrings turned to the man in the suit and said, "Did you see that child's face?" The man didn't answer. He was already looking at his phone. 3 rows back in the general boarding line, a college-aged kid had his camera pointed at the spot where Malachi had been standing. An older gentleman near the window seats was shaking his head slowly, the way people shake their heads when they've witnessed something they can't quite process yet. 2 mothers traveling together had their heads bent close, whispering. And in the middle of all of it, Raina Bell was still standing by the wall. Same position, same stillness, but something had shifted in her face. The professional composure was cracking at the edges. Not breaking, just cracking. Officer Amos Reed hadn't left. He had told Coulter he would stay until the gate cleared. What he hadn't said, what he hadn't needed to say, was that he was also staying because of what he'd read in that envelope. Because you don't read something like that and walk away in 30 seconds. You carry it for a while. You carry it whether you want to or not. He stood near the window watching the tarmac, and he was quiet. Tessa Rowe was the first person to approach him. She came from the boarding line, stepping out of it deliberately. Her tote bag shifted to one shoulder, her voice low and direct. "Officer Reed." He turned. "What was in that envelope?" she asked. Reed looked at her for a moment. He didn't answer right away. "I know you can't tell me everything," Tessa said. I'm not asking for everything. I'm a pediatric speech therapist. I've worked with children in the foster care system, children in trauma recovery programs. I watched that boy for 20 minutes. I've seen that kind of stillness before. She paused. I need to know if he's going to be okay. Reed held her gaze. Something in him seemed to weigh the question carefully before he answered. He's going to his aunt, he said finally. She's been fully briefed. There are people waiting for him. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. No, Reed said quietly. It's not. Tessa absorbed that. She pressed her lips together and nodded once slowly, like someone accepting a truth they'd already suspected. How long has he been dealing with whatever this is? Ma'am, Reed said. I can't discuss the specifics of what's in those documents. What I can tell you is that that child conducted himself today with more composure and more dignity than most adults I've encountered in 16 years of this job. And whoever prepared him, whoever sat down with that 9-year-old boy and made sure he knew exactly what to do and what to say and how to protect himself, they did their job well. Tessa's eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, with something more complicated. Anger and grief and a strange, painful form of admiration all mixed together. And the flight attendant, she said. What happens to her? Reed didn't answer that one. He didn't have to, because at that exact moment across the gate area, Coulter Shaw was having a conversation with Raina Bell that was not going the way Raina had expected. She had expected when Coulter came to her that he would do what supervisors do, walk her through the protocol review document, the incident, maybe file a routine report. She had expected this to be uncomfortable and procedural and eventually resolved. She had 22 years with the airline. She had never had a serious disciplinary mark. She had always believed she was doing the right thing. Raina, Coulter said, and his voice was the voice of a man who does not enjoy this part of his job. I need you to understand what just happened here. I performed a passenger verification, she said. Her voice was a little too controlled. An unaccompanied minor with a first-class ticket and a restricted access notation, Raina, is a legitimate red flag under airline policy. Raina. He said her name again, and this time it stopped her. The restricted access notation on his reservation exists specifically to protect him from situations like this one. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Coulter said carefully that the flag on that child's file was not there because something was suspicious. It was there because the people responsible for his safety didn't want his personal information accessible to anyone who didn't have clearance. Because the details of his situation, the real details, are sensitive enough that if the wrong person accessed them in a public space, it could put him at risk. Raina stared at him. What kind of risk? Coulter looked at her for a long moment. The kind that required a court order. The silence between them was very loud. A court order, Raina repeated. Sealed, Coulter said. Along with medical documentation and a Child Protective Services travel authorization. That packet didn't contain suspicious material, Raina. It contained a child's legal protection plan. Her jaw moved, but no words came out. No. And you stopped him in the middle of a public terminal. Coulter continued, his voice never rising, which somehow made it worse, and questioned him loudly enough for 30 people to hear, and physically blocked him from boarding, and held his documents. I didn't know, and called security, which drew a crowd, which meant that a child who is traveling under a court-ordered protection plan was publicly identified and scrutinized by strangers in a major airport. He stopped. He let that sit. Raina's face had gone through several colors in the last 2 minutes. I was doing my job, she said, but the certainty was gone from it now. It came out less like a defense and more like a question she was asking herself. I know you believe that, Coulter said, and we're going to need to talk more about this. But right now, I need you to know the airline's legal team has already been notified, because someone in this crowd was filming. She looked up sharply. Filming. About 40 seconds of it, from what I understand. Starting from when you physically prevented him from boarding. Raina Bell, 22-year veteran, silver wings on her lapel professional record, without a single serious mark, sat down heavily in the nearest chair. And she put her face in her hands. Across the terminal, Gerald was processing the last of the general boarding passengers, moving through the routine with the efficiency of someone who wants very badly for this morning to end. But the line was slow. People were lingering, not pretending anymore. Just outright watching the way people watch when something has happened in a public space, and they can't quite make themselves leave it. The college kid with the phone was talking in a low, rapid voice to his seatmate. I got most of it, from when she blocked him. You could hear her say the seat wasn't for him. His seatmate, a young woman with noise-canceling headphones hanging around her neck, said, "You should post that." I already did, he said. Neither of them knew in that moment what those 40 seconds of shaky phone footage would do over the next 72 hours. Neither of them could have predicted it. But the video was already out there, already traveling the way things travel now, fast and far, and without asking anyone's permission. The older black woman who had touched Malachi's head as she passed her name was Gloria Merritt, and she was 67 years old and was flying to Portland to visit her daughter, boarded the plane, and found her seat in economy class. She sat down, buckled her seatbelt, and looked out the window for a long time. She didn't know what was in the envelope. She didn't know the specifics of what had happened. She just knew what she'd seen: a small boy standing alone, holding his ground with a grace that had no business existing in a 9-year-old, and she knew what it had reminded her of. She knew the particular posture of a black child who has been taught to be careful, who has been taught that the world will question him, and that he must have his answers ready, and that he must never flinch. She pressed her fingers to the window and was quiet. Tessa Rowe found her seat in Economy 224C middle seat, which she barely noticed. She sat with her tote bag on her lap, instead of stowing it. Her phone in her hand, not opening any apps, not texting anyone. Just thinking. Running back through the 20 minutes she'd spent watching Malachi Wren stand in that first-class lane. The way he'd answered every question. The way he'd known exactly what the packet was for and exactly when to use it. The way he'd said without flinching, "My travel coordinator told me only to open it in front of an officer or a supervisor." A 9-year-old with a travel coordinator, not a parent, not a family friend who happened to know about airports. A travel coordinator, someone whose job it was to make sure a child like Malachi could move through the world safely, with a specific set of instructions and a sealed envelope and a first-class seat that was not a luxury. It was a logistics decision. First-class boards first. First-class D-planes first. Fewer people, less chaos, more control. Someone had thought all of that through. Tessa thought about her own job. She worked with children who had experienced trauma. Children who had lost language under the weight of what had happened to them, children who needed months of patient, careful work before they could form a sentence about what they were feeling. She had sat across from dozens of children in her career and understood professionally and personally how much damage the world could do to a small person who had not asked for any of it. She thought about Malachi's eyes when he'd said, "I know." Not performance, not bravado. Just knowledge. The particular terrible knowledge of a child who has already been through something, survived it, and been taught how to survive it again if necessary. She opened a new note on her phone. She didn't know what she was going to write yet. She just knew she needed to start writing something before the thought left her. The plane pulled back from the gate at 9:47 a.m. in seat 2. Malachi had his seatbelt on and his backpack stowed and his envelope in the seat pocket in front of him, not in the overhead bin, not in his bag, in the seat pocket, where he could reach it, where it was close. The flight attendant working first class on this particular flight, not Raina, a different woman named Carol who had gotten on the plane earlier and had not been present for anything that happened at Gate 14, came by with the pre-departure beverage service. She stopped at 2A and looked at Malachi with professional warmth. "Good morning, sweetheart. Can I get you something to drink before we take off?" "Water, please," Malachi said. "Coming right up." She poured it and handed it to him. Then, because something about the boy's stillness made her pause, she said, "Is this your first time flying?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Are you going to see family?" "My aunt?" "That's nice." She smiled. "You'll have someone to see you when you land." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I will." She moved on down the cabin. Malachi drank his water in small sips and looked out the window at the brightening Georgia sky and thought about Portland. He had never been to Portland. He had a picture of his aunt, not a photograph, he didn't have many of those anymore, but a picture in his head from a video call, a woman with a wide smile and natural hair, and a voice that sounded warm even through a phone screen. She had cried on the call. Not in a sad way, or not only in a sad way. She'd kept saying his name Malachi. Malachi. Like saying it was the proof of something. He had not cried. He almost did once, but he had blinked it back. He was good at that. The plane reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dinged off. A few passengers around Malachi opened laptops or settled into movies. The man sitting in 2B, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s named Dave, a contractor from Marietta, had been sneaking glances at the boy since they sat down. Not in a suspicious way. In the way of someone who has children of his own and finds something about this particular small person sitting alone in first class quietly remarkable. After a few minutes, Dave said, "Hey buddy, you doing okay?" Malachi turned from the window. "Yes, sir." "You flying alone?" "Yes, sir." "That's pretty brave," Dave said, and he meant it with complete sincerity. Malachi considered this for a moment. "I'm okay," he said. "You want to watch something? I've got a tablet. I've got like 50 movies downloaded." Something shifted in Malachi's face. It wasn't much, just the faintest softening, the kind of look a child gets when an adult treats them like a regular child instead of a problem or a circumstance. "What kind of movies?" he asked. "Everything," Dave said. "Action, animated, sports. I've got all the Marvel ones if you're into that." Malachi looked at him. "Do you have the one with the raccoon?" Dave laughed a real laugh, sudden and genuine. "Guardians of the Galaxy." Yeah, I've got that one." "Okay," Malachi said. Dave pulled out his tablet and set it up between them. And for the next 90 minutes, 30,000 feet above the American Midwest, a 9-year-old boy who had spent the morning being questioned in a public terminal sat next to a stranger who asked him nothing difficult and watched a talking raccoon save the galaxy. He laughed twice. Both times, Dave pretended not to notice, just in case noticing would make it stop. Back at Atlanta, Hartsfield-Jackson Gate 14 had returned to its ordinary operation. New passengers were filtering in for the next departure. The blue carpet of the first-class lane was empty. Gerald was doing his job. The gate looked exactly as it always looked. But in the security office on the concourse level, a conversation was happening that would eventually change several things. Officer Reed was at his desk writing his incident report. He wrote carefully, choosing every word with the precision of someone who knows that words in official documents have weight. He wrote what he had observed. He wrote what he had read in the envelope. He wrote his assessment of the situation and the child's condition, and the way the incident had unfolded in a public space. When he got to the section about the crowd and the filming, he paused. He sat back in his chair. His job required him to document. His job did not require him to predict consequences. But 16 years of experience had given him a particular felt-in-the-gut sense for when something was going to grow beyond the room where it started. And this had that feeling. The phone footage. The crowd. A black child physically blocked from a first-class seat in a major American airport, a sealed court order in a manila envelope. He already knew before he finished his report that by tomorrow morning, this story would be in places neither he nor Raina Bell nor Coulter Shaw could control. He was right. At 12:14 p.m. Central Time, while Malachi's plane was somewhere over Nebraska, a Twitter account with 43,000 followers posted the video. The caption read, "Flight attendant physically blocks a black child from boarding first class and calls security. Watch his face. Watch how still he is. This child was clearly taught to survive encounters like this. That's not okay." The video was 41 seconds long. By 2 p.m., it had been viewed 800,000 times. By 4 p.m., it was 3.2 million. The comments were a storm, the particular kind of American storm that rises when a specific image meets a specific wound. Hundreds of people writing about their own children, about their own airport experiences, about what it means to teach a black child how to stand still under pressure and not flinch and keep his hands visible and speak politely and wait. About the fact that this was not unusual. About the fact that this child's stillness was not remarkable. It was learned. It was necessary. It was survival dressed up as composure. And underneath all of that, threading through every comment thread and quote tweet and response video, One question kept surfacing. The same question asked 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different strangers who had watched 41 seconds of footage and found themselves unable to look away. What was in that envelope? Nobody knew yet. Nobody outside that gate knew the specifics of what Officer Reed had read. The documents were sealed. The details were protected. The airline had issued no statement. Coulter Shaw had said nothing publicly. Reed had said nothing publicly. But the question was out there now, spreading as fast as the video itself. And it had the particular energy of a question that people already suspected the answer to, or suspected that the answer when it came was going to be devastating. In Portland, Oregon, a woman named Diane Wren Malakai's aunt, 34 years old, an elementary school librarian, was sitting in the arrivals terminal with her phone in both hands, watching the notification count on a screenshot someone had texted her climb in real time. She had been texting back and forth with the travel coordinator for the past 2 hours. She knew what had happened at Gate 14. She knew in broad strokes about the questioning that crowded the video. She had not watched the video yet. She couldn't make herself watch it, because she knew what she was going to see when she did. She had practiced all of this with Malachi. She had been on the call when the travel coordinator went through every scenario with him. She had watched that boy absorb the information with a seriousness that broke her heart. The seriousness of a child who has already learned that the world requires him to be prepared, that the world is not always safe, that being prepared is the only control he has left. She had told him, "You're going to be okay." She had believed it when she said it. Sitting in the Portland arrivals terminal, watching the notification count climb, she was still trying to believe it. Her phone buzzed. A text from the travel coordinator: "Flight is on time. He's okay. He watched a movie." Diane read that twice. He watched a movie. Such a normal, small, child-sized thing. She pressed the phone against her chest and closed her eyes. Then she opened them and looked at the arrivals board and counted the minutes. At 35,000 feet, Malachi had fallen asleep. The tablet was still balanced on the seat tray in front of him, paused on a frame from the movie. Dave had dimmed the screen when he noticed the boy's eyes closing. He'd looked at the child sleeping in first class, small against the wide seat, one hand resting on the tray table. Face completely relaxed in the way a child's face gets relaxed in sleep, all the careful composure dissolved into just a kid. And Dave had felt something move through him that he couldn't quite name. He had 3 kids at home, 11, 14, 17. He'd flown with all of them. He'd complained about it sometimes, the logistics, the cost, the chaos of traveling with children. He'd never once thought about what it would mean to put one of them on a plane alone. Not at 9. Not with a sealed court order in a seat pocket. He looked away from the sleeping boy and out the window at the clouds. He thought about what the flight attendant at the gate had done. He hadn't seen all of it. He'd been in the boarding line, but he'd seen the end of it. He'd seen the boy stumble backward. He'd seen the envelope hit the floor. He'd seen the crowd. He thought that was someone's child. He thought that child held himself together in front of a crowd of strangers. He thought 9 years old. Outside the window, America stretched on below in its vast, complicated, beautiful, terrible expanse. The plane moved through it, steady and clean, carrying its passengers forward, carrying a sleeping boy toward a woman who was counting the minutes in an arrivals terminal and trying to believe that everything was going to be okay. And somewhere in the depth of that sleep, in whatever place children go when the careful armor of wakefulness falls away, Malachi Wren was just a boy. Not a case number. Not a file with restricted access. Not a child in a protection plan. Not a headline or a video or a question in a comment thread. Just a boy dreaming. Whatever came next, and a great deal was coming next, more than anyone in that terminal had yet begun to understand, he was for this 1 hour above the clouds, simply and entirely at rest. The plane landed in Portland at 12:58 p.m. Pacific Time. Malachi woke up 12 minutes before touchdown, the way children wake on planes, suddenly and completely going from deep sleep to full alertness in the space of a single breath. He sat up. He looked out the window. He reached into the seat pocket and checked that the envelope was still there. It was. He took it out and held it. Dave, who had been awake for the last hour reading a construction industry newsletter on his phone, noticed. He said nothing about the envelope. Instead, he said, "Good sleep." "Yes, sir," Malachi said. "Portland's nice. You ever been?" "No, sir." "It rains a lot," Dave said, "but the people are good." Malachi looked out the window at the gray-white sky. "That's okay," he said. "I don't mind rain." They landed smooth and clean. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, Dave stood and pulled his carry-on from the overhead bin, and then without being asked, he reached up and pulled Malachi's backpack down too. He set it on the seat beside the boy. "There you go," he said. Malachi looked at him. "Thank you." "You take care of yourself, Malachi." The boy paused. "How do you know my name?" Dave smiled a little sheepish. "Heard the flight attendant back at the gate, before we boarded." He held the boy's gaze. "You did real well today. I mean that." Malachi didn't answer right away. He put his backpack on, tucked the envelope under his arm, and said quietly, "I had to." Dave watched him walk toward the front of the plane, and he stood there long enough that the woman behind him had to say, "Excuse me," twice before he moved. At the arrivals gate in Portland International, Diane Wren had been standing in the same spot for 40 minutes. She had a handwritten sign, not a printed one, handwritten in big blue letters on the back of a manila folder that said, Malachi. She was holding it with both hands, even though her hands were shaking slightly. She hadn't eaten since morning. She had watched the video twice, finally sitting in a bathroom stall in the terminal with her earbuds in, and both times she had had to press the back of her hand against her mouth to keep from making noise. She had seen her nephew's face on a screen. She had seen the moment Raina Bell blocked the jet bridge door. She had seen the envelope hit the floor. And she had watched Malachi pick it up, straighten his backpack strap, and look the flight attendant directly in the eyes. She had watched that and thought, I taught him that. We taught him that. And the pride and the grief of that thought lived in the same exact place inside her chest, and she could not tell them apart. The arrivals door opened. Passengers came through in the usual stream, rolling bags, coats over arms, phones already out. Diane scanned every face. A family, a businessman, a couple, an elderly man moving slowly with a cane, a group of college students, and then, small backpack envelope, dark blue hoodie, Malachi. He came through the door and stopped. He scanned the crowd the way she had watched him scan things in the video. Careful, methodical, not rushing. Then he saw the sign. Then he saw her face. And something happened to him that had not happened once during the entire morning at Gate 14. He cried, not loud, not dramatic. His face didn't crumple the way children's faces crumple on television. It just broke open quietly from the inside. His chin went first, then his eyes. And by the time Diane had pushed through the last two people between them and dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around him, he was shaking in that deep, full-body way that means a person has been holding something for a very long time. She held him tight. She said his name. Just that Malachi, Malachi, the way she had said it on the video call, like saying it was proof. He held the envelope in one hand the whole time. Even then, even in her arms. He held it. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She just held on tighter. They stayed like that for a long time in the middle of the Portland arrivals hall, while strangers moved around them and gave them space the way strangers sometimes do, recognizing instinctively that they are in the presence of something real. At 1:47 p.m. Pacific Time, while Malachi was eating his first meal in Portland, a grilled cheese sandwich at a diner 2 blocks from Diane's apartment, still holding the envelope beside his plate, like a talisman, the airline issued its first statement. It was 4 sentences long. It expressed regret for any distress caused during the boarding process for Flight 147 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. It stated that the airline takes the safety and dignity of all passengers seriously. It stated that an internal review had been initiated. It thanked the public for their patience. The internet did not thank the airline back. By 2 p.m. Pacific, the video had crossed 9 million views. The statement had been quote-tweeted over 40,000 times. Most of those quote tweets containing some variation of 4 sentences isn't going to cut it. A civil rights attorney in Chicago named Marcus Webb had posted a thread that had been shared 200,000 times, laying out in specific and careful legal language what the presence of a sealed court order in that child's travel packet meant, and why Raina Bell's actions in a public terminal potentially constituted a serious breach of that child's legally protected status. Marcus Webb's thread ended with 7 words. Someone needs to answer for this publicly. The pressure that had been building since 12:14 p.m. was no longer building. It had arrived. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters in Dallas, Texas, the afternoon had become a different kind of emergency than the morning had been. The morning's emergency was a gate incident. The afternoon's emergency was a crisis. The vice president of customer experience, a woman named Patricia Holt, was in her third consecutive meeting watching a social media dashboard that looked like a seismograph reading during an earthquake, and she was saying things like comprehensive review and full accountability, and we need to get ahead of this in a voice that was calm, because she had trained it to be calm in situations like this, but underneath it, she was not calm at all. She had read Reed's incident report. She had read it twice. She had read the part where he described the contents of the envelope, and she had sat alone in her office for 4 minutes afterward, not taking any calls, not answering any messages, just sitting with what she had read and understanding fully without the filter of crisis management or public relations what had actually happened to that child at Gate 14. Then she had made the calls. At 3:15 p.m. Central Time, Raina Bell received a call from airline HR. She was at home by then. She had driven home from the airport in a silence so complete it felt like a physical thing. A weight in the car with her. She had changed out of her uniform. She had made coffee and not drunk it. She had sat on her couch and looked at the video on her own phone because someone had sent it to her. Of course, someone had sent it to her, and she had watched herself block the jet bridge door with both hands, flat against Malachi's chest. She had watched the envelope hit the floor. She had watched the boy pick it up, and she had watched her own face in that footage. A face she recognized and did not recognize at the same time. And she had tried to remember exactly what she had been thinking in that moment. What logic had been running in her head? What instinct had fired that had made her look at a 9-year-old in a first-class line and decide with complete confidence that something was wrong? She knew what the answer was. She had known it since Coulter Shaw had said the word court order with that particular stillness in his voice. She had known it, and she had not wanted to know it, and she had been sitting with it for 6 hours. When HR called, the woman on the other end of the line was professional and measured and clearly reading from a script. She used words like administrative leave and pending investigation and no admission of liability in the interim. She told Raina she would receive formal documentation within 24 hours. She asked if Raina had legal representation. Raina said, "Not yet." The HR woman said, "You may want to arrange that." When the call ended, Raina sat holding her phone. Outside her window, the Atlanta afternoon was doing whatever Atlanta afternoons do in October. Ordinary light, ordinary traffic, ordinary sounds. Everything outside was ordinary. Everything inside her was not. She thought about the moment Reed had walked away from her at Gate 14. He had taken 3 steps, turned back once, and said very quietly just to her, not for the crowd, "Flight Attendant Bell, what you saw in those documents is protected. I need you to understand that what happened here today affected a child who has already been through something that most people in that terminal will never have to imagine." He had paused. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it so you understand the full weight of what happened." She had nodded. She had said, "I understand." She had not understood. Not yet. Not fully. She was starting to now. In Portland. Diane Wren's apartment was small and warm, and full of the things she had spent 3 weeks preparing a bedroom with a new comforter that had planets on it because she had asked Malachi once on a video call what his favorite subject was, and he had said, space. A shelf with books, some for his reading level, some a little above it because the social worker had told her he read above his grade level and she had taken that information and run with it. A small desk by the window, a lamp shaped like a moon. Malachi stood in the doorway of his room for a long time. Diane stood behind him, not speaking, waiting. He looked at the comforter. He looked at the books. He looked at the moon lamp. He put his hand on the doorframe. Then he said, "Can I keep the envelope here, in this room?" "Of course," Diane said. "It's your room." "Where should I put it?" "Wherever feels right to you." He walked in slowly. He put the envelope on the desk in the center where he could see it from the bed. He stood back and looked at it. Then he turned around and looked at Diane. "Does this mean I can stay?" he asked. The question was so direct and so simple and so enormous that Diane had to take a breath before she could answer it. "Yes," she said. "The court order makes it official. You're here. This is yours." He looked at the room again. He looked at the moon lamp. "Can I turn it on?" "It's your lamp," she said. He walked over and turned it on. A soft yellow light spread across the room. He stood in it for a moment with his back to her. "I like it," he said. She pressed her fist against her mouth and counted to 3 before she trusted her voice. "Good," she said. "I'm glad." At 6:22 p.m. Eastern Time. Marcus Webb's phone rang. He was at his desk in Chicago, working through the responses to his thread, when a number he didn't recognize came through. He almost didn't answer. He answered. The woman on the other end identified herself as a producer for a national morning news program. She said they were planning a segment on the Gate 14 incident for the following morning, and they were looking for legal expertise. She had read his thread. Would he be willing to come on? Marcus Webb said, "Yes, and I want to talk about the full picture, not just the video." The producer said, "What do you mean the full picture?" Marcus said. "What do you know about what was in that envelope?" A pause. "We know it contained legal documents. We don't have specifics." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had been careful in his thread. He had spoken in broad legal terms. Protection orders, restricted access, child safety protocols. He had not speculated about specifics, but he had been thinking about it all afternoon, because the broad legal terms he had used pointed in a specific direction, and he was a man who had spent 15 years working in family and civil rights law, and he knew what kind of situation produces a sealed court order and a restricted access notation in a child's travel file and a first-class seat that is a logistics decision rather than a comfort upgrade. He knew. And he thought about what it meant that Raina Bell had stopped that child in a public terminal and held him up for 20 minutes in front of a crowd. "I'll come on your show," he said, "but I want a full segment. Not 2 minutes. A full segment." The producer said, "We can do 10 minutes. 15, Marcus said. A pause. Done. At 8 p.m. Pacific. Malachi had been in bed for 30 minutes. He was not asleep. Diane had come in to say goodnight and found him lying on his back, looking at the ceiling, hands folded on his chest, the moon lamp still on. "Can't sleep," she said. "I was just thinking." She sat on the edge of the bed. "About what?" A long pause. "About the lady at the airport." Diane kept her voice very neutral. "What about her? Do you think she knew?" Malachi asked. "About the envelope. About what's in it." "No," Diane said. "I don't think she did." Malachi was quiet. "Then why did she stop me?" Diane looked at her nephew, 9 years old, lying in a bed with a planet comforter in a room she'd spent 3 weeks preparing, asking a question that had no good answer and every honest answer. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people make judgments about a situation before they have all the information. They see something that surprises them, and instead of asking careful questions, they react to the surprise." "She wasn't surprised I was alone," Malachi said. "She was surprised about the seat." Diane absorbed that. "You're right," she said. "That's more accurate." Another long quiet. "I wasn't going to open the envelope," he said. "Even when she asked. I knew I wasn't supposed to." "You did exactly right." "But she kept asking, and people were watching." He paused. "I didn't want them to watch." "I know, baby. I don't like being watched like that. No one does." He turned his head toward her. In the light of the moon lamp, his face was unguarded in a way it almost never was, had almost never been for a long time. "Am I going to have to do that again?" he asked. "Carry the envelope, know what to say, practice." Diane reached out and put her hand over his. "Not the same way," she said. "Not anymore. You're here now. This is different." He looked at her for a long moment, searching the way children search an adult's face when they want to know if the adult is telling the whole truth or just the comfortable part of it. Malachi was very good at that, at reading faces. He had learned it early. Whatever he found in hers seemed to satisfy him. He turned back to the ceiling. "Okay," he said. She stayed until his breathing slowed and deepened, and then she went to the kitchen and sat at her table in the dark, and allowed herself finally quietly, with both hands pressed flat on the surface of the table, to feel everything she had been holding back since she'd watched a video of her nephew stumbling backward in an airport terminal 10 hours ago. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed at 9:14 p.m. It was the travel coordinator, a woman named Sharon Felt, who had been managing Malachi's case for 7 months, who had put together the packet and chosen the first-class seat and prepared Malachi for exactly the kind of situation that had unfolded at Gate 14, who had been monitoring the news coverage all day from her home in Atlanta with a specific professional dread. Sharon's text said, "You need to see what just dropped. It's about the airline's internal records. Something came out. It changes everything." Diane read the text 3 times. Then she typed back, "What kind of records?" Sharon's response came in 30 seconds. "Employee complaint history. Raina Bell. Someone leaked it." Diane set the phone face down on the table. She sat for 10 seconds. She turned it back over. "What did it say?" she typed. The 3 dots of Sharon typing appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared again. Like Sharon was deciding how much to say in a text message, and then reconsidering, and then deciding again. Then the message came through. This wasn't the first time. 3 words after that, followed by a link to a news article published 40 minutes ago by a reporter at a national outlet who had apparently spent the last 6 hours making phone calls that had produced something significant. Diane clicked the link. She read the headline. She read the first 3 paragraphs. And then she put the phone down very carefully on the table because her hands had started shaking, and she did not want to drop it. The article said that according to documents obtained by the outlet, Raina Bell had been the subject of 2 prior passenger complaints, both filed within the last 4 years, both involving black passengers. Both complaints had been reviewed internally. Neither had resulted in formal disciplinary action. Both had been closed, with a notation matter reviewed, no further action required. 2 complaints. Same pattern, same employee, 0 consequences. Until today. The article quoted an anonymous airline employee described only as a current staff member with knowledge of HR processes who said there was a culture of looking the other way on certain kinds of complaints. Everyone knew it. Nobody wanted to be the person who pushed back. The article had 3 more paragraphs. Diane could not read them yet. She sat with what she already had. 2 prior complaints, both involving black passengers. No disciplinary action. She thought about the envelope on Malachi's desk, visible from his bed. She thought about the sealed court order inside it, and the medical notations, and the child trauma record, and every piece of paper that documented what had happened to her nephew before he became her nephew, before he came to live in this apartment with a planet comforter and a moon lamp. She thought about the morning, Gate 14. A 9-year-old boy standing in the first-class lane, holding himself perfectly still, while a woman with 2 prior complaints in her personnel file and no disciplinary record put both hands flat against his chest. And she thought about the word Sharon had used in her text, without knowing exactly what it would mean to the woman reading it. Wasn't the first time. She stood up. She walked down the hall. She stood outside Malachi's door and listened to him breathe in the quiet dark. Then she went back to the kitchen and picked up her phone and called Marcus Webb's office number, which she had found because she had read his thread 3 times and saved it because something in his words had made her feel like he was a person who understood the full shape of this thing. Not just the viral moment, not just the video, but the whole shape of it, the depth of it, what it actually cost a child to be prepared for a world that would stop him in a boarding line and demand that he prove his right to be there. Marcus answered on the 2nd ring. He listened. When Diane finished talking, there was a silence on the line, not uncomfortable but full, the kind of silence that precedes something. Then Marcus Webb said, "Mrs. Wren, I was planning to go on television tomorrow morning to talk about a gate incident. What you've just told me combined with what came out tonight means this is no longer a gate incident." "What is it?" Diane asked. "It's a pattern," he said, "and patterns require a different kind of response." Outside the Portland apartment, rain had started. Soft, steady Pacific Northwest rain tapping against the windows. Just like Dave had told Malachi on the plane, it rains a lot, but the people are good. Inside, a boy slept under a planet comforter. On a desk, an envelope sat in the center, visible from the bed exactly where Malachi had placed it. And in a kitchen, his aunt sat across from her phone and understood with the particular clarity of exhaustion and grief and something that was not quite anger and not quite hope, but contained both, that tomorrow was going to be a very different kind of day. She was more right than she knew. Marcus Webb did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk in Chicago until 2 a.m. reading everything. The incident report summary that had been leaked to 3 separate outlets by midnight. The HR complaint files. The airline's internal policy documents on unaccompanied minor handling, and the 2 prior passenger complaints against Raina Bell that were now being dissected in real time by journalists, legal analysts, and several million people on the internet who had opinions and were not keeping them to themselves. He read all of it carefully, the way he read everything, slowly looking for the thing underneath the thing. Because in 15 years of civil rights and family law, Marcus had learned that the document people argued about was rarely the most important document. The most important document was always the one that showed you the system behind the incident. The one that told you this wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern operating exactly as designed. By 1 a.m., he had filled 4 pages of a legal pad. By 2 a.m., he had called his paralegal and told her to clear his Thursday. By 2:30 a.m., he had drafted the outline of something that was not a television appearance. It was bigger than that. He didn't have a name for it yet, but he knew the shape of it the way you know the shape of a door before you open it. He turned off his desk lamp. He sat in the dark for a moment. He thought about a 9-year-old boy holding an envelope in both hands in the middle of a boarding terminal. He thought about 2 prior complaints with 0 consequences. He thought about a notation in an HR file that said, "Matter reviewed, no further action required." He thought someone decided those 2 passengers didn't matter enough to act. He thought someone is going to have to answer for that decision by name. Then he went to bed because he had television at 7 a.m. and he needed to be sharp. At 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, October 15th, Tessa Rowe was sitting at her kitchen table in Atlanta, watching the morning news program on her laptop with a cup of coffee going cold beside her because she kept forgetting to drink it. She had been up since 5. She had not slept well, the kind of not sleeping where you lie in bed and replay a scene over and over, examining it from different angles, the way you do when your brain has decided that this particular thing needs to be fully processed before it will let you rest. The thing her brain kept returning to was not the moment Raina blocked the door. It was earlier than that. It was the moment Malachi had said, "My travel coordinator told me only to open it in front of an officer or a supervisor." The precision of that sentence. The readiness of it. The fact that it had been prepared, rehearsed, delivered exactly as intended by a 9-year-old who had been put through a practice run of the worst-case scenario, so that when the worst case arrived, and it had arrived, he would know what to do. She thought about what it cost a child to live in that kind of readiness, to carry that kind of preparation, to be 9 years old and already know that the world will question your right to be where you are, and that your best defense is a sealed envelope and a practiced sentence, and the ability to stand very still. She thought about the children she worked with every day, trauma survivors, most of them, children who had lost language under the weight of what had happened to them, children who needed months, sometimes years of patient, careful therapeutic work to find their way back to their own voices. She thought about the note she had started on her phone on the plane and never finished. She opened her laptop and pulled up the morning show just as Marcus Webb appeared on screen. He was in a television studio, sharp suit, calm face, the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the precise management of it. The anchor across from him, a woman named Karen Ellison, who had been doing this for 20 years, and had the practiced neutrality of someone who asks difficult questions for a living, looked at him and said, "Mr. Webb, the airline has called this an isolated incident involving one employee's judgment. You've said publicly that you believe it's more than that. Explain what you mean." Marcus looked directly into the camera. Not at Karen, at the camera. "An isolated incident," he said, "is when something happens, once is identified, is addressed, and does not happen again. What we have here is a documented pattern. 2 prior complaints. Same employee, same type of passenger. 0 disciplinary response that culminated in a flight attendant physically blocking a 9-year-old child from boarding his flight and calling security on him in a public terminal. A child who was traveling under a sealed court order and a Child Protective Services authorization. That is not an isolated incident. That is a system that failed 3 times. And the third failure happened in front of a camera. 1. Karen said, "The airline argues that flight attendants have a responsibility to flag unusual situations. A black child in first class is not an unusual situation," Marcus said. "A black child in first class is a passenger. The fact that it was flagged as unusual is itself the problem." The studio was very quiet for a beat. Karen said, "What is your next step?" Marcus said, "We are filing a formal civil rights complaint with the Department of Transportation by end of business today. And we are requesting the full personnel file, not the leaked summary, the full file under a formal legal discovery process, because I believe what we've seen so far is not the complete picture." Karen leaned forward slightly. "What do you believe the complete picture looks like?" Marcus was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I believe it looks like a culture," he said. "A culture in which certain complaints are filed, reviewed, and quietly buried. And I believe there are people inside that airline who know exactly how that culture operates. And I believe some of those people are going to want to talk." Tessa sat back in her chair. She thought he's right. She thought I was there and I didn't do enough. She picked up her phone and opened the unfinished note. At 7:23 a.m. Pacific Time. Malachi Wren woke up in Portland to the smell of pancakes. He lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room, taking it in the way he took everything in, methodically cataloging the details. Planet comforter. Moon lamp off, now morning light coming through the curtains. Shelf of books. Desk. Envelope in the center of the desk, exactly where he had placed it. He got up. He walked to the desk and put his hand on the envelope. He did this every morning, had done it for the past 7 months since Sharon Felt had given it to him in her office and explained what was inside and why it mattered. It was a habit. A check. Still here. Still real. Still mine. He went to the kitchen. Diane was at the stove. She turned when she heard him. She looked at his face and did that thing adults do when they're trying to read whether a child has slept and whether that sleep was okay. She must have decided it was because she said, "Chocolate chip or blueberry." "Chocolate chip," Malachi said. He sat at the table. He watched her make the pancakes. There was a normalcy to it. The smell, the sounds, the ordinary morning rhythm of it that felt strange to him in a way he couldn't fully name. Not bad strange. Just unfamiliar in a way that required adjustment. "Your name is on the news," Diane said. She said it matter-of-factly, while flipping a pancake, not looking at him. She had decided sometime around 3 a.m. that she was going to be honest with him, not hide things or manage what he knew, because Malachi was a child who had already proven that he could handle the truth better than most people handled comfortable fictions. He absorbed this. What are they saying? They're saying what happened at the airport wasn't right, that the lady who stopped you has a history of doing similar things to other people. A pause. Is she in trouble? Yes. Another pause. Longer. Am I going to have to talk to anyone about what happened? Not if you don't want to, Diane said. That's completely your choice. No one can make you talk about anything. He considered this. Sharon said the envelope protects me. It does. Even from the news, especially from the news. Diane set the plate in front of him. Your name, your case, your documents, all of it is sealed. No one can publish it. No one can report it. The law protects you. Malachi looked at his pancakes. He picked up his fork. Then he said without looking up, Good. Because I don't want to talk about it. I just want to be here. Diane sat down across from him. Then that's what you'll do. He ate 3 pancakes. She watched him eat and felt something large and quiet settle in her chest. Something that was not peace exactly, but was moving in that direction. At 9 a.m. Eastern, Raina Bell's attorney, a man named Philip Cross, whom she had called the night before, and who had met with her for 2 hours that morning, called the airline's legal department and requested an urgent meeting. Philip was a labor attorney, experienced and precise, and he had spent the morning reviewing everything available to him. The video, the leaked HR summary, the morning news coverage, Marcus Webb's television appearance, and he had formed a clear picture of where this was heading. He had told Raina sitting across from her at her kitchen table at 7:30 that morning. The airline is going to make a decision about your employment in the next 48 to 72 hours. Given the public pressure and the civil rights complaint, that decision is almost certainly going to be termination. Raina had looked at him steadily. I have 22 years. I know, Philip said. And we're going to make sure that's part of the conversation. But Raina, I need you to be honest with me. The 2 prior complaints. Tell me exactly what happened in those situations. She had told him. Slowly, carefully, because she was a precise person who did not like to misrepresent things, even to her own attorney. She told him about both situations, the passengers, the specific concerns she had, flagged the reviews that had followed. She told him what she remembered thinking and why. Philip had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "In your own assessment, when you look at those 3 situations together, do you see a pattern?" A long silence. I see, Raina said slowly, that in each case I believed I had a legitimate professional justification. That's not what I asked, Philip said. Another silence. Longer. I see, she said finally, that in each case the passenger was black. Philip nodded. He did not say anything else. He let her sit with that. She sat with it for a while. Then she said very quietly, I didn't think of myself as that kind of person. Philip said, most people don't. At 10:15 a.m. Eastern in the airline's Dallas headquarters, Patricia Holt walked into a conference room where 7 people were waiting for her legal HR communications operations and 2 members of the executive team. She set her laptop on the table and did not sit down. I'm going to make this fast, she said, because we don't have time to be slow. Marcus Webb filed with the DOT an hour ago. We have journalists outside this building. We have 14 million views on a video that is still climbing. And we have an employee with 2 prior complaints that were closed without disciplinary action. I need to know who made those decisions and why, and I need to know in the next 20 minutes. The head of HR, a man named Barry Schiff, who had been with the airline for 11 years, cleared his throat. Both complaints went through the standard review process. Barry. Patricia's voice was flat. I don't want process. I want names. Who reviewed those complaints, who signed off on closing them, and why? Barry looked down at his folder. He said a name. 2 people in the room shifted in their seats. Patricia said, Is that person still employed here? Yes, Barry said. Get them in here, Patricia said. She sat down. The room was very quiet. At 11 a.m. Eastern, Officer Amos Reed received a call from a number he recognized, the airline's legal department, a woman he had worked with before on other incidents. She was professional and to the point. She told him the airline was conducting an internal investigation and wanted to formally request his incident report and his personal account of what he had observed at Gate 14. Reed said, You'll get the report through the official channel. My personal account is already in it. The woman said, We may have follow-up questions. Reed said, I'm available. After he hung up, he sat for a moment. Then he called a number he didn't recognize. A number Sharon felt Malachi's travel coordinator had sent him by text the night before, with a message that said, If you want to know the full picture, call this. It's Diane Wren. She's expecting your call. Malachi is okay. Diane answered on the first ring. Reed identified himself. He said, I wanted to check in. How is he? Diane said, He ate 3 pancakes this morning. Reed made a sound that was almost a laugh, surprised out of him. Good, he said. That's good. He asked if the flight attendant was in trouble. Diane said. What did you tell him? I told him yes. A pause on the line. That's accurate, Reed said. He also asked if he'd have to talk to anyone about what happened. He doesn't, Reed said immediately. That's absolute. Everything in that packet is sealed. No one is getting near those details without a court order of their own. Diane exhaled. Not dramatically, just a single controlled breath, the sound of someone who has been holding tension in their chest and has found one small place to release it. Thank you, she said. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, Mrs. Wren, Can I ask you something? Yes. The envelope, the preparation, the practiced responses. Who did that with him? Sharon Felt, Diane said. His travel coordinator. And before Sharon, his caseworker, a woman named Dr. Paula Greer at the Fulton County Family Services Office. They spent 3 sessions with him preparing for exactly what happened yesterday. Reed absorbed that. 3 sessions. Yes. To prepare a 9-year-old for an airport. To prepare a 9-year-old, Diane said carefully, for a world that was going to look at him and decide it had questions before it had facts. She paused. They did a good job. They did, Reed said. He did. At 12:40 p.m. Eastern, the airline posted its second statement. This one was not 4 sentences. It was 11 paragraphs. It began with a direct and unqualified apology to Malachi, to his family, and to the other passengers who had witnessed the incident. It acknowledged the prior complaints. It announced the immediate termination of Raina Bell's employment. It announced a full independent review of HR complaint handling processes to be conducted by an outside firm. It announced mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff. It announced the creation of a passenger advocacy office specifically for incidents involving minors and protected travelers. And in the final paragraph, it said that the airline had reached out directly to Malachi's legal guardian to offer a personal apology, and that it had made a donation, the amount unspecified, to a child trauma recovery organization in Malachi's name. The internet received this statement differently than it had received the first one. Some people said it wasn't enough. Some people said it was a start. Some people argued about which of those positions was correct, with the particular intensity of people who have strong feelings about the difference between accountability and performance. Marcus Webb posted 2 sentences. Termination is a beginning, not an ending. The systemic review is what matters. Tessa Rowe read the statement at her desk between patient sessions. She read the part about the passenger advocacy office twice. She thought about Malachi standing in the first-class lane envelope under his arm, answering questions with that terrible, careful composure. She thought about the note on her phone, still unfinished. She opened it. She started writing, not a note this time. Something more structured. An outline rough and unpolished and probably full of holes but real. A program. Something for children like Malachi. Children who move through complex situations alone. Children in foster care and protective custody, and family transition. Children who needed not just legal preparation, but emotional preparation. Children who needed to know that there were adults in the world who would stand 3 feet away and not touch them and say, "You don't owe anyone an explanation." She wrote for 20 minutes straight, forgetting the cold coffee on her desk and the next patient in the waiting room until her receptionist knocked. She saved the document. She sat back. She thought, this is the thing I'm supposed to do next. At 1:15 p.m. Pacific Time, Malachi was at the library. Diane had taken him not to distract him, not to escape the news cycle, but because she had promised him 2 weeks ago on a video call that the first full day after he arrived, she would take him to the library and let him pick any 5 books he wanted. A promise was a promise. He moved through the stacks with a quiet focus that made the librarian a young woman named Jess, who had heard about the airport story that morning from 3 different people, watch him with a particular attentiveness. She didn't say anything. She just watched him pull books from shelves, read the back covers, carefully return some, keep others. He was methodical and serious and entirely absorbed. He came to the desk with 6 books. Jess said, "You can only do 5. He looked at the 6 books. He put 1 back. He looked at the remaining 5. He added 1 more. He looked at Diane. She said 5, Diane told him. He considered for another moment. Then he put 1 back and pushed the 5 toward Jess with both hands. Jess checked them out and handed them back. She looked at him and said, "Good choices. All of them." He said thank you. He said it the way he said everything, politely, precisely, with a steadiness that seemed calibrated by experience rather than personality. Jess watched them leave, and then sat down at her desk and put her face in her hands for about 4 seconds. Because she had children. Because she had read the news that morning. Because some things require 4 seconds to process even when you are at work. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern, Philip Cross called Raina Bell. She was sitting in her living room with the television off, and her uniform, which she would not need anymore, hanging on the back of the bedroom door because she hadn't moved it yet. She had been sitting very still for several hours, not catatonic, not collapsed, sitting with the specific deliberateness of someone who is trying to think clearly and is finding it difficult. Philip told her about the termination. She had expected it. She said very little. He told her about the civil rights complaint. He told her what the process would look like, what her rights were, what his strategy would be going forward. She listened. She asked 2 precise questions. He answered them. When he finished, she said, "Philip, the other 2 passengers, from the prior complaints. What about them? Do you know who they are?" A pause. "I have their names from the complaint files, yes." "I want to contact them," she said. Philip was quiet for a moment. "Raina, that is not something I would advise at this stage. Not through lawyers," she said. "Not formally. I want to contact them myself, personally. Raina, I need to," she said. Her voice didn't crack, but it carried something. Weight. The weight of someone who has spent 36 hours arriving slowly and painfully at a destination they didn't want to reach. "I know what you're going to say. I know what it looks like legally. But those 2 people filed complaints, and nothing happened to them. Nothing changed. And then I walked into a gate with a child who had a court order in his pocket, and I did it a 3rd time, and it went out to 40 million people. And those first 2 people, I need them to know that I understand, that I finally understand what I did." Philip was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Let me think about how to structure this so it doesn't blow back on you legally." "I don't care about the legal exposure," she said. "I do," Philip said. "Let me think about it." She said okay. She hung up. She sat in the quiet living room. She thought about Malachi's face in the video, the exact 3 seconds when her hands had been on his chest and he had looked at her. She had watched that clip 17 times. She had been looking for something in it, some anger, some fear, some reaction she could file somewhere and understand. But his expression in those 3 seconds was not anger or fear. It was recognition. That was the word she had finally landed on sometime around 4 a.m. Recognition. Like he had expected this. Like he had practiced for exactly this. Like the world had already told him through accumulated experiences, she would never fully know that this was a thing that happened. That you could be exactly where you were supposed to be, carrying exactly the right documents, doing everything correctly, and someone would still look at you and say, "I don't think so." She understood at last and too late what it meant that he had been prepared for her. At 3:45 p.m. Pacific Time, Sharon Felt arrived at Diane's apartment. She had flown standby, got the first available seat out of Atlanta, landed at PDX at 2:30, took an Uber straight there. She had not called ahead. She had texted, "I'm coming. I need to see him." Diane opened the door and looked at Sharon, small, mid-40s, red hair going gray at the temples, eyes that had clearly not had enough sleep, and stepped back to let her in. Malachi was at his desk, reading one of his new library books. He looked up when Sharon came in. Sharon stopped in the doorway of his room. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then she said, "You did everything exactly right." He put the book down. "I know," he said. And then, "Were you scared when you were watching the news?" Sharon made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "Yes," she said honestly. "I was very scared." "I wasn't," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you weren't. That's because you were ready." "You made me ready," he said. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his desk chair, not hugging him because she knew he needed to be asked first, and she said, "Can I hug you?" He considered it for 1 second. "Okay," he said. She hugged him carefully, the way you hug someone who has survived something, aware of the fragility underneath the strength. He let her. He held his book in one hand the whole time. When she pulled back, she looked at him and said, "The envelope is on your desk." "Yes," he said. "Do you still need it here?" He looked at it. He thought about it. He said, "For now." She nodded. "For now is fine. At 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern." Marcus Webb held a press conference outside his Chicago office. He stood at a small podium on the steps and spoke for 12 minutes without notes. He covered the civil rights complaint, the termination, the announced investigation. He talked about the pattern in the HR records. He talked about what the presence of a sealed court order in a child's travel documentation means in legal terms, and why the public handling of that child in a boarding terminal represented a failure at every level, individual, institutional, and systemic. And then, in the 11th minute, he said something that stopped every journalist in front of him from typing and made the cameras hold very still. He said, "I have been contacted in the last 24 hours by 2 individuals who filed complaints against this employee in prior years. Both complaints were closed without action. Both individuals are black, and both of them independently used the same word to describe what happened to them. They said they felt like they had to prove they belonged, like their presence in a space they had every legal right to occupy was somehow automatically suspect." He paused. "That is not a feeling that comes from one bad employee's judgment. That is a feeling that comes from a system that consistently, quietly over time, tells certain people that proof is required. And when a 9-year-old child with a sealed court order has been taught by a team of trained professionals to carry that proof in a sealed envelope because the world will demand it, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world makes that preparation necessary?" The cameras held. Nobody moved. Marcus Webb gathered his papers. He said, "We are asking that question publicly now, and we will not stop asking it until it is answered." In Portland, Diane Wren watched the press conference on her laptop at the kitchen table. Sharon sat beside her. Malachi was in his room reading The Moon Lamp on against the early dark. When it ended, Diane closed the laptop. Sharon said quietly, "It's going to change things." Diane looked at the closed laptop. She thought about the word Marcus had used, proof. She thought about the envelope on Malachi's desk. She thought about what it meant that a 9-year-old needed proof of his right to exist in a first-class seat. She thought about the moon lamp and the planet comforter, and 3 library books stacked on the desk beside the envelope, and a boy who had eaten 3 chocolate chip pancakes that morning. Like the world was a place where that was simply allowed. She said, "It already has." Down the hall, Malachi turned a page. 3 days after Marcus Webb's press conference, a letter arrived at the airline's Dallas headquarters. It was not from a lawyer. It was not from a journalist. It was not from the Department of Transportation or a civil rights organization or any of the dozens of entities that had been sending official correspondence to that building since Tuesday morning. It was handwritten on plain white paper in the careful penmanship of someone who had taken their time with every word. The return address was a Portland, Oregon zip code. The name on the envelope was Diane Wren. Patricia Holt read it alone in her office with the door closed. It was 2 pages long. It did not threaten. It did not demand. It did not use legal language or political language or the language of public accountability that had surrounded this situation for 72 hours. It was written in the voice of a woman who had spent 3 weeks preparing a bedroom for a child planet comforter, moon lamp shelf of books, and who had stood in an arrivals terminal holding a handwritten sign and watched that child walk through a door and finally break open. The letter said, "I am not writing to add to the pressure you are already under. I am writing because I believe that what happened to my nephew cannot be fully understood from 41 seconds of video footage, and because I believe that the people making decisions inside your organization deserve to understand the full weight of what occurred." It said Malachi did not cry once during the entire incident at Gate 14. He had been taught not to. He had been taught to stand still, speak politely, hold the envelope, and wait. He had been taught this because the people responsible for his safety understood that the world would question him, and that his best and only protection was preparation. When a 9-year-old child's safety plan includes rehearsing how to survive an encounter with an airline employee, something has gone profoundly wrong. Not in the child, but in the world the child is being prepared for. It said, "He is sleeping well now. He likes chocolate chip pancakes. He checked out 5 books from the library on his second day here." These are small things. They are also the only things that matter. It said in the final paragraph, "I am not asking for anything from you except this, that the people in your organization who make decisions understand that the cost of this incident was not a video going viral." The cost was a child who has already survived something devastating, being forced to survive something else in public unnecessarily. Please make sure that cost means something. Patricia Holt read the letter twice. Then, she picked up her phone and called her assistant and said, "I need you to find me Diane Wren's phone number in Portland, Oregon. And then I need 20 minutes with no interruptions." Her assistant said, "Yes, ma'am." Patricia sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she called. At 9:22 a.m. Pacific Time, Diane's phone rang with a Texas area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The woman on the other end said, "Mrs. Wren, my name is Patricia Holt. I'm the Vice President of Customer Experience at the airline. I read your letter this morning." Diane said nothing. Patricia said, "I want you to know that I read all of it. And I want you to know that it is being shared with the CEO, with the board, with every member of the team working on this review. Not as a document, as a letter. From you." Diane said carefully, "Why are you calling me personally?" "Because you asked me to understand the full weight of it," Patricia said, "and I cannot do that through a statement, or a press release, or a legal process. I can only do it by calling you." A silence. "How is he?" Patricia asked. Diane looked down the hallway toward Malachi's room, where she could hear the quiet sound of him reading. He read out loud to himself sometimes, just slightly above a whisper, a habit he'd had for years. "He's reading," she said. Patricia absorbed that. Then she said, "Mrs. Wren, I know that nothing I say reverses what happened. I know that. But I need you to know that your letter changed something in this building that 72 hours of legal pressure did not change. The legal pressure produced responses. Your letter produced understanding. And those are not the same thing." Diane was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do with that understanding?" she asked. Patricia said, "More than we announced publicly." Diane said, "Tell me." And Patricia Holt P of Customer Experience, former flight attendant herself 20 years ago. Different airline, different world, told her. Not in press release language. In the plain, direct language of a woman who had read a 2-page letter on white paper and understood in a way she had not fully understood before what her industry had been quietly, consistently failing to see. In Atlanta, on the same morning, Tessa Rowe was in a meeting that should not have been possible to schedule in 72 hours, but was because sometimes the right crisis reaches the right people at exactly the right moment, and things that normally take months take days instead. She was sitting across from the director of a child advocacy nonprofit called Safe Path Forward, a woman named Dr. Amara Collins, who had spent 20 years working at the intersection of child trauma legal protection and social navigation. Tessa had cold-called the organization 2 days ago. She had expected voicemail. Dr. Collins had picked up herself. On the table between them was Tessa's outline, printed now 12 pages full of holes and rough edges, but structurally real. A program. Not therapy exactly, not legal preparation exactly. Something in between. Something designed for children like Malachi who move through complex systems. Foster care, protective custody, family transition, and needed more than documentation. Needed to know how to carry themselves through a world that was going to demand proof of their right to exist in certain spaces. Dr. Collins had read the 12 pages before the meeting. She had brought a pen. She had made notes in the margins. She set it on the table between them and said, "This is the right idea." Tessa said, "It has a lot of gaps." "Yes," Dr. Collins said. "We'll fill them. How long have you been working with trauma-impacted children?" 9 years. "And this came to you watching a boy at an airport?" "It came to me," Tessa said, "watching a boy who already had the documentation, who already had the legal protection, who had done everything right and still got stopped, still got questioned, still had to stand in front of 30 strangers and justify himself. And I thought the envelope is necessary, but it's not enough. What's not in the envelope is just as important as what is." Dr. Collins tapped the outline with her pen. "What's not in the envelope," she said slowly. "Say more." "The ability to read a room," Tessa said. "To know when an adult is escalating and how to respond without escalating yourself. To understand your rights in plain language, not legal language. To know that your stillness is a strength. To know that there are adults in the world who will stand next to you, not over you, not in front of you, just next to you, and say this child is not alone. She paused. Malachi knew all of that. Someone taught him all of that. Most kids in his situation don't have a Sharon Felt. Most kids in his situation go into those moments without any of it. Dr. Collins was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to call the program?" Tessa looked at her. "I was thinking about something he said on the plane, to the flight attendant who offered him a drink. She asked if he was going to see family. He said, 'I'll have someone to see me when I land.'" She paused. "I want to call it Someone to See You." Dr. Collins looked at her for a long beat. Then she uncapped her pen and wrote it at the top of the first page of the outline. "Someone to see you." "Okay," she said. "Let's build it." On October 21st, 1 week after Gate 14, Sharon Felt drove to the Fulton County Family Services office and sat down with Dr. Paula Greer, the caseworker who had worked with Malachi for 18 months before the placement with Diane was finalized. They sat in Dr. Greer's office with the door closed and 2 cups of coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who have been through something together without being in the same room for it. Dr. Greer said, "He really held." Sharon said, "He really held." 3 sessions, Dr. Greer said, and he absorbed every word. "He did more than absorb it," Sharon said. "He understood why, not just what to do, why, that's the difference. That's why he didn't panic." Dr. Greer was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the other kids, the ones in active placement right now who might be in a similar situation traveling, transitioning, navigating public spaces without a consistent adult present." "Me too," Sharon said. "The protocol we built for Malachi, it needs to be formalized, written up, adopted across the department." "I know. I started drafting it last night," Dr. Greer said. She turned her laptop screen toward Sharon. 12 pages of dense, careful text protocols, checklists, session guides, prepared language for children of different ages. The language that Malachi had used at Gate 14, the language that had stopped Raina Bell in her tracks only for a supervisor or an officer, was in there. Documented, teachable, transferable. Sharon read the first 3 pages without speaking. Then she said, "It needs to go beyond Fulton County." "Yes," Dr. Greer said. "I know." "I'm going to talk to the state office," Sharon said. "And I want to connect you with a woman named Tessa Rowe. She's building something parallel, more advocacy-focused, less procedural. I think together they're the full picture." Dr. Greer said, "Is she good?" "She stood 3 feet from that boy for 20 minutes in a boarding terminal and didn't leave," Sharon said. "Yes, she's good." The twist that nobody saw coming happened on October 23rd. Not from the airline, not from Marcus Webb, not from any of the institutions or organizations or public figures who had been moving through this story with the weight and velocity of official process. It came from Raina Bell. Philip Cross had spent 4 days navigating the question of whether Raina's request to contact the 2 prior complainants was legally advisable. He had consulted 2 colleagues. He had run through every scenario, and ultimately he had told her, "If you do this, it cannot be strategic. It cannot be calculated. If there is any appearance that this is part of a legal defense, it backfires catastrophically. The only way to do this is to mean it completely, and only you know if you mean it completely." Raina had said, "I mean it completely." Philip had arranged it through an intermediary, brief neutral communication, no pressure. The choice entirely theirs. Both individuals had the right to decline. Both had the right to ignore the request entirely. One declined. One did not. Her name was Veronica James. She was 41 years old, a software engineer from Baltimore, and 2 years ago she had been flying to a conference and had been stopped in the first-class lane by a flight attendant who had questioned her seat assignment, her ID, and her reason for traveling in front of a gate full of passengers before a supervisor had intervened and cleared her through. She had filed a complaint. The complaint had been closed. She had flown that airline twice more since then, each time in economy, because she had decided she didn't want to deal with it again, which was a decision she resented having to make and thought about more often than she wanted to admit. She agreed to meet Raina. They met in a coffee shop in Baltimore on a Wednesday afternoon. Philip was not there. No lawyers, no mediators, no officials of any kind. Just 2 women at a table. Raina had prepared what she wanted to say. She had written it down and reread it and then left the paper at home because she decided it needed to come without notes. She sat across from Veronica James and said, "I am not here to ask you for anything. I'm here because I owe you an accounting. I stopped you 2 years ago in a boarding line because something in my mind decided your presence in that space required explanation. I did not realize in that moment that that instinct was bias. I believed I was doing my job. I understand now that believing something sincerely does not make it right. And I understand now, looking at what happened to a 9-year-old child last week, that the instinct I acted on with you was the same one. And it should have been stopped 2 years ago. It should have been stopped with you. And it wasn't. And I am sorry for that. Not for the airline. For me personally, I am sorry." Veronica James looked at her across the table for a long time. Then she said, "Do you know what I did after I filed that complaint?" Raina said no. "I went home and I sat at my kitchen table and I told my 14-year-old son what happened. Because he was going to be flying alone for the first time that year. I told him what happened, and I told him what to do if it happened to him. I told him to have his boarding pass ready before he got in line, to speak politely, to not argue, to ask for a supervisor calmly, to keep his hands visible." She paused. "I was preparing my 14-year-old son for an airport, the way other parents prepare their kids for talking to police. And I sat there doing it, and I thought, this is wrong. This should not be my homework." Raina did not look away. "You're right," she said. "It shouldn't." "That child last week," Veronica said. "He was 9. Yes. Someone prepared him the same way I prepared my son. Yes." Veronica looked down at her coffee cup. "I don't know if I forgive you," she said. "I don't know if that's where I am yet. But I needed to hear you say what you said. Without lawyers. Without it being part of something official." She looked up. "So thank you for that." Raina nodded. Her jaw was tight with the effort of keeping herself composed. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. Veronica said, "Tell me one thing. Anything. When you saw him in that line, that boy, what did you actually see?" A silence, long and full and honest. Raina said, "I saw a child who didn't fit my picture of what first class looked like." Veronica nodded slowly. "That's the most honest thing you've said." "I know. Hold on to that," Veronica said. "Whatever comes next for you, hold on to exactly that. Because that's the thing that has to change. Not just in you. In everyone who looks at a first-class boarding line and has a picture in their head of what it's supposed to look like." Raina walked out of that coffee shop into the Baltimore afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. Philip Cross had texted twice asking how it went. She didn't answer yet. She just stood there and breathed. She had 22 years of a career behind her. She had an apartment in Atlanta she'd lived in for 15 years. She had a sister in Memphis, and a mother in Savannah, and a life she'd built carefully and with pride. And she was standing on a sidewalk in Baltimore, understanding with a clarity that was almost physical in its intensity, that the person she had believed herself to be and the person she had actually been operating as were not the same person, and that the distance between those two people had cost others. Veronica James, the other complainant who had declined to meet, and a 9-year-old boy with a sealed court order and a practiced sentence, and a calm so devastating it had gone out to 40 million people on the internet. That distance was the work now, closing it. She didn't know yet what that looked like in practical terms. She didn't know what came after termination, after legal process, after the public story moved on to something else. But she knew what Veronica James had said, hold on to exactly that. She would. In Portland, on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Gate 14, something small happened that Diane would remember for the rest of her life. Malachi came into the kitchen while she was making coffee. He was wearing his hoodie, same dark blue one from the airport, and his hair was not combed yet, and he was carrying one of his library books holding his place with his thumb. He climbed onto the kitchen stool and set the book on the counter and looked at her. She said, "Chocolate chip." He said, "Blueberry today." She got out the batter. She heard him open his book. She heard the quiet whisper of him reading to himself. She poured circles of batter onto the griddle. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking and the sound of the morning. And then, without preamble, without build-up, without any particular weight in his voice, Malachi said, "I want to put the envelope away." Diane's hand stilled on the spatula. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his book, not at her. "In the desk drawer," he said. "Not on top. In the drawer." She waited a moment. "You ready for that?" He considered it, really considered it the way he considered everything, taking his time. "It doesn't have to be where I can see it all the time," he said. "I know it's there." "Okay," she said. "I still want to know where it is." "It'll be in the drawer. And I can take it out if I need to." "Any time," she said. He nodded. He went back to his book. Diane turned back to the pancakes. She flipped them very carefully, because her hands were not quite steady, and she did not want to ruin the blueberry ones. On November 3rd, Tessa Rowe and Dr. Amara Collins presented the Someone to See You pilot program to a room of 32 child welfare caseworkers, legal advocates, and pediatric specialists at a community center in Atlanta. The presentation lasted 90 minutes. The program outline, now 40 pages. The holes largely filled, the rough edges, largely smoothed, was distributed in a binder with a simple blue cover. Sharon Felt was in the front row. Dr. Paula Greer was beside her. Officer Amos Reed had driven over on his day off and was sitting in the back row with his arms crossed and his face neutral, and his eyes moving carefully over every slide. When Tessa finished, she asked if there were questions. There were many questions, good ones, practical ones, the kind of questions that come from people who recognize a real thing and want to know how to hold it properly. After the formal session ended and the room began to filter out, Reed approached Tessa. He waited until most people had cleared. He said the sentence he used at the gate, only in front of an officer or a supervisor. "Is that in your program?" Tessa looked at him. "It's in the section on self-protection language." "It worked," Reed said. "I want you to know that it worked. That sentence, the precision of it, the clarity of it, it changed the trajectory of what happened. It was the moment the situation became something official instead of something a flight attendant could manage alone." Tessa said, "Sharon Felt and Dr. Paula Greer built that. I'm putting it in the program so 40 kids have it instead of one." Reed nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "I think about him," he said. "More than I thought I would. About the way he held that envelope." "Me too," Tessa said. Reed said, "He's okay in Portland." "He put the envelope in a drawer last Saturday," Tessa said. "That's the update I got." Reed looked at her. He understood immediately what that meant, what it cost, and what it signified, and how much ground had to be covered for a child to move from holding something in both hands at all times to choosing to put it somewhere safe and trust that it would still be there. He said, "Good." On December 1st, the airline's independent review was published, all 64 pages of it, released without redaction, because Patricia Holt had made the decision that partial transparency was not going to be sufficient, and that the only way through this was through it completely. The review documented systemic failures in complaint processing, identified structural gaps in unaccompanied minor policy, and recommended 47 specific changes. 31 of those recommendations were adopted immediately. The remaining 16 were put on a formal 12-month implementation timeline with quarterly reporting requirements that were made public. Marcus Webb read the report in his office in Chicago. He read all 64 pages. He posted a single paragraph online when he finished. "This report does not close this case. It opens a door that should have been opened years ago. The 2 passengers whose prior complaints were buried deserved this door. The child at Gate 14 deserved this door. The question now is whether the institutions on the other side of it are willing to walk through." The paragraph was shared 300,000 times. Gloria Merritt, the 67-year-old woman who had touched Malachi's head as she passed him in the boarding line, who had flown on that same plane, who had sat at her window and pressed her fingers to the glass and thought about the particular posture of a black child who has been taught to be careful. Read Marcus Webb's paragraph at her kitchen table in Portland, where she now lived 6 blocks from her daughter. She read it and sat with it for a moment. Then she printed it out. She folded it and put it in her Bible in the page where she kept things that mattered. She had not told anyone about touching that boy's head. It had not felt like something to tell. It had felt like something to do, a small, human, necessary thing. The kind of thing you do when you recognize something in a child's posture and you want them to know without words, without complication, that they have been seen correctly. She thought about him sometimes. The small boy with the envelope. She thought about the fact that he was somewhere in this city, 6 blocks away, or 60 blocks away, putting blueberry pancake mornings between himself and that terminal. She hoped he was. She hoped every morning he got a little further from it. She believed he would. On the last day of that year, Malachi Wren turned 10 years old. Diane made a cake. Sharon Felt flew in for the weekend. Dr. Paula Greer sent a card. Tessa Rowe sent a book, a collection of stories about real people who had changed difficult situations by holding their ground and refusing to be moved, which Tessa had spent 2 weeks selecting, and which arrived wrapped in blue paper with a note that said simply, "For Malachi, who already knows how this is done." There were 6 people at the table. Malachi sat at the head of it, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the chair was empty, and he sat in it, the way he sat in things, with a quiet, settled certainty. Diane lit the candles. The room was warm and full of the sounds that warm rooms full of people who love each other are full of, talking, laughing. The scrape of chairs, someone telling a story that goes on slightly too long, someone else laughing before the punchline. Malachi looked at the 10 candles on the cake. He looked at the faces around the table. Then he looked at Diane. She said, "Make a wish." He thought about it. He took his time the way he took everything. He thought about Portland and blueberry pancakes and a library card with his name on it and a moon lamp on a desk and a drawer that held something important and didn't need to hold it on the surface anymore. He thought about what it felt like to walk through an arrival's door and see his own name written by hand on the back of a manila folder. He thought about the plane and the clouds, and the man named Dave, who had not asked him anything difficult and had just shared a tablet and let him laugh at a talking raccoon 30,000 feet above the middle of America. He thought about the envelope. He thought about what was inside it. Every document, every sealed court order, every notation that said this child has been through something, this child deserves protection, this child has people who are fighting for him. He thought, I know what I want. He leaned forward. He blew out every candle at once. The room cheered. Malachi sat back in his chair and looked at the smoke rising from 10 extinguished flames and said nothing because what he wished for was his and he was keeping it. But the look on his face, unguarded, present, belonging completely to the moment, to the room, to the people in it, was the look of a boy who had stopped surviving and started living. He had walked through Gate 14 with a sealed envelope and a practiced sentence and 9 years of preparation for a world that would demand he prove his right to be in it. He had proven it. He had boarded his flight. He had arrived. And in the end, through the video and the viral storm and the terminated employee and the 64-page report and the program in a blue binder and the 2 women in a Baltimore coffee shop and the man in the back row of a community center room and the 67-year-old woman with a printed paragraph in her Bible and every other thing that had moved and shifted and changed in the wake of a 41-second clip from a boarding terminal in the end, the most important thing that happened was this. A boy who had been taught to hold on, learned slowly in a warm apartment in Portland with blueberry pancakes and a moon lamp, and people who kept showing up that he was finally allowed to let go. That was not a small thing. That was everything.